Well, crisis and disasters can be useful to anyone who has a program that they have trouble implementing during normal circumstances, because the appeal of a crisis and a disaster is that people are confused, they are concentrated on their daily emergencies, they're saving their families, they're saving their homes, they're frightened, and in situations when people are frightened, they often want strong leaders, they often become more childlike. Disasters can also be opportunities for people to react differently. People can overthrow their leaders in a crisis. People can be more independent, but they also have this ability. They have this ability to serve leaders with an undemocratic agenda, and so neoliberalism is not supported by the majority of people because it causes unemployment, it takes away services that people depend upon. So that's the appeal of a crisis for neoliberals. Well, New Orleans was a very useful disaster for the Bush administration because New Orleans was a very contested city before Katrina hit, before the levees broke. There was a lot of tension and there were a lot of issues, like, for instance, the poor people in New Orleans, people without a lot of money, live in many of them live in large housing, public housing. But the public housing in New Orleans, unlike in many other cities, is downtown. In many cities, the public housing is on the outskirts of town in not very desirable locations. But in New Orleans, there's very large public housing developments that are built right in the center near the tourist district. And the developers in New Orleans have always wanted that land because they could turn it into condominiums, they could turn it into hotels. So immediately after that disaster, you heard from developers, you heard from politicians, even a politician who said, we couldn't clean out the housing developments, but God did. That's disaster capitalism. Another aspect of disaster capitalism is the idea of seeing disasters as a new market, as a privatization opportunity. And this also happened in New Orleans after Katrina. You had a private military company, Blackwater, that had really gained their fortune in Iraq, arriving within hours in New Orleans to be a kind of a private police force. And just now in California with the wildfires, we're seeing another version of this, where there's private fire response, where if the people who have money and have paid insurance companies for a special service, they call it a concierge service, these companies are coming to the wealthy homes, to the multi-million-dollar mansions, and spraying them with material that makes them more resistant to fires. It's called fire retardant. So this is a new industry, protection from the disasters that come with a warming climate, with climate change. It's almost like survival becomes a luxury item, and something that the rich can afford and they will pay extra for, and so it's a new economy. Well, anything is possible, but I think what is more accurate that's actually going on is that the current course we're on is a guarantee of more and more disasters. If we do nothing about climate change, if we don't invest in public infrastructure, if we don't invest in alternative energy, if we don't regulate the casino economy, we will just have crisis after crisis after crisis, because the economy works now in a boom and a bust. You saw it with dot-coms, now we see it with subprime mortgages. The warming temperatures create more Category 5 hurricanes, more tornadoes, more forest fires. So it's, I often get these questions about conspiracies, and what I say is that the conspiracies aren't even necessary, because just doing nothing means there will be more and more crises. Oh yes, absolutely. Russia and China are two of the more successful capitalist economies at the moment, and they are also, China is not a democracy, and Russia is barely a democracy. And I think that both of these examples really show that it's not just that you don't need democracy to have neoliberalism. If you look at China, you see the most successful capitalist economy in the world thrives under authoritarian conditions. This is the highest growth rates and so on. But what I show in the book is that in 1989, there was the first stages of this economic transformation, this so-called free market, which is not actually a free market transformation. And people were resisting and they were angry. They did want reform, they did want change, but they wanted a democratic change. They didn't just want the Communist Party leadership who controlled them under Mao to control them under this Wild West capitalism and pass the goods of the public sphere over to their kids and their cronies. So there was the huge demonstrations in Tiananmen Square, which were demanding democracy. And certainly there was a created crisis in this context and a terrible shock, which was the Tiananmen Square massacre. And that shock terrorized the country for decades because it was a message from the government that said, look, we're willing to use military tanks on our elite university students. So what does that say to workers who are thinking of organizing a union? It says this government will do anything. And in Russia, 4 years later, you had something very similar happen, where there was a clash between democracy and economic shock therapy. And Yeltsin responded by calling in the military to fire on Russia's elected parliament. So once again, when there is a clash between democracy and neoliberalism, often democracy loses. When I argue that neoliberalism is not compatible with democracy, people say, well, what about Thatcher? Margaret Thatcher was elected, and she was able to have a very radical privatization revolution in a democracy. But what I show in the book is that Margaret Thatcher wasn't able to do this without a crisis. And in fact, as she tried to, she became so unpopular that she was about to lose office before she had succeeded. In 1982, before she had instituted her revolution, she dropped to 25% in the polls, which was the lowest point in the history of British polling for any prime minister. And what saved Margaret Thatcher and what allowed her revolution to take place was the Falklands War. The Falklands War was a gift to Margaret Thatcher. Her popularity went in less than a year from 25% to 59%. And then she used that war to declare war on the trade unions. She said, we fought the enemy without in the Falklands, and now we must fight the enemy within. And the enemy within was the coal miners.